The cold bit through Violet Preston's thin coat as the sleigh runners hissed over packed snow. But the January chill was nothing compared to the ice in her stepbrother's eyes when he reached across and shoved her hard into the darkness. She tumbled from the moving sleigh with a scream that the howling Colorado wind swallowed whole, her body hitting the frozen ground and rolling down an embankment in an explosion of white powder and searing pain. By the time she stopped moving, half buried in a snowdrift with her left arm twisted beneath her at an unnatural angle, the sleigh bells had faded into the distance, and she was utterly alone in the wilderness between Denver and the mountain passes, the winter of 1885 showing her no mercy. Violet tried to push herself up, but agony shot through her arm and ribs, forcing a cry from her lips that came out as barely more than a whimper. Her fingers were already going numb inside her soaked gloves, and snow had worked its way down the back of her dress, melting against her skin in rivulets of ice water that made her shudder violently. She could taste blood where she had bitten her tongue during the fall, and when she touched her forehead, her hand came away red. The sky above was the color of slate, promising more snow before nightfall, and she had no idea how far they had traveled from the last town, or how long it would take for someone to find her out here in this frozen wasteland. Her stepbrother Marcus had been planning this, she realized through the fog of pain and shock. He had insisted on taking her to visit their aunt in the mountains, had been so solicitous about bundling her into the sleigh and wrapping blankets around her legs. Their mother had died 6 months ago, and Marcus had inherited everything from his father, Violet's stepfather, who had passed 2 years prior. Everything except the small trust fund Violet's real father had established before he died when she was just a child. Marcus had been pressuring her for weeks to sign it over to him, claiming he could invest it better, that a woman of 22 had no head for business matters. When she had refused that morning, something had shifted in his expression, gone cold and calculating. Now she understood. If she died out here in the snow, Marcus would inherit that trust as her only living relative. The simplicity of it was almost admirable in its cruelty. She tried to call out, but her voice was weak and the wind tore the sound away. Her teeth chattered so hard she thought they might crack, and the cold was seeping deeper into her bones with every passing moment. She had to move, had to find shelter, but when she tried again to stand, the pain in her ribs made black spots dance across her vision, and she collapsed back into the snow. This was how she was going to die, she thought with a strange clarity. Frozen in a snowbank while Marcus went on to live comfortably off both their inheritances. She wondered if he would even pretend to mourn her, or if he would simply claim she had fallen from the sleigh accidentally and he had been unable to find her in the storm. The injustice of it burned in her chest, but the burning was fading now, replaced by a creeping numbness that almost felt peaceful. Her eyes drifted closed despite her best efforts to keep them open. She did not know how much time had passed when she heard the sound of hoofbeats and a man's voice cutting through the wind, sharp with concern. Strong hands touched her face, her throat, checking for signs of life, and then she was being lifted with surprising gentleness. The movement sent fresh waves of pain crashing through her, and she cried out weakly, trying to explain about Marcus, about being pushed, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. "Easy now, easy," the voice said, low and soothing with a Texas drawl that wrapped around the words like warm honey. "I have got you. You are going to be all right, miss. Just hold on for me." She forced her eyes open and found herself looking up into a face that was all strong lines and worried brown eyes beneath the brim of a snow-dusted hat. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with a few days' worth of dark stubble on his jaw and the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors. He had wrapped his own heavy coat around her and was carrying her toward a large bay horse that stood patiently nearby, its breath steaming in the frigid air. "My stepbrother," she managed to gasp out. "He pushed me." The man's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "Someone did this to you deliberately?" She nodded, or tried to, and then the darkness rushed up to claim her and she knew nothing more. When Violet woke again, she was warm. Blessedly, impossibly warm, wrapped in what felt like a dozen blankets and lying on something soft. A fire crackled nearby, and she could smell coffee and something savory cooking. She opened her eyes slowly and found herself in a small but well-built cabin, the log walls chinked tight against the cold and the single room neat and organized. The man from the snow was crouched by the fireplace, stirring something in a pot, and he must have sensed her movement because he turned immediately. "Welcome back," he said, rising and crossing to kneel beside the narrow bed where she lay. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was thrown from a moving sleigh," Violet said, her voice coming out hoarse and scratchy. She tried to smile, but her face felt stiff and sore. "Where am I?" "My cabin, about 5 miles from where I found you. My name is Xavier Thompson. I was heading back from checking my trap lines when I spotted you in the snow." He reached for a cup of water on the small table beside the bed and helped her sit up enough to drink, supporting her shoulders with careful hands. "I have done what I could for your injuries, but I am no doctor. Your left arm is broken, and I think you have got some cracked ribs. You were half frozen when I found you, and you have been unconscious for nearly 6 hours. Violet's eyes widened. 6 hours? Marcus will be long gone by now. He was supposed to be taking me to our aunt's house in the mountains, but I realize now there probably never was any such plan. He wanted my inheritance." The water felt good on her raw throat, and she drank greedily until Xavier eased the cup away. "We will deal with your stepbrother," Xavier said, and there was something almost dangerous in his tone despite the gentleness of his hands. "Right now, you need to focus on healing. That arm needs to be properly set by someone who knows what they are doing, and you need rest and warmth. There is a town about 15 miles from here, Winter Creek, Colorado. It has a doctor. But there is another storm coming in tonight, and we will not be able to travel until it passes." "How long will that be?" Violet asked, looking toward the single small window where snow was already beginning to fall more heavily. "Could be a day, could be 3, Xavier said honestly. "Winter storms in these mountains do not follow any schedule but their own, but I have got plenty of supplies and you are safe here. I promise you that." There was something in the way he said it that made Violet believe him absolutely. She studied his face more carefully now that she was conscious and clear-headed. He had strong features, not handsome in the classical sense but striking, with those warm brown eyes and a mouth that looked like it smiled easily despite the serious expression he wore now. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused from hard work, but they had been infinitely gentle when touching her. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life, Mr. Thompson." "Xavier," he corrected. "And you do not need to thank me for doing what any decent person would do." He stood and returned to the fire, ladling something from the pot into a bowl. "Can you eat? It is just venison stew, but it is hot and it will help warm you from the inside." Violet realized she was ravenous. She could not remember the last time she had eaten, certainly not that morning with Marcus watching her so closely. "I would love some." Xavier brought the bowl over and helped her sit up more fully, propping pillows behind her back. The movement made her ribs ache and her arm throb in its makeshift splint, but the pain was manageable, and the smell of the stew made her mouth water. He had set her arm himself, she realized, and done a decent job of it from what she could tell. The thought of him caring for her while she was unconscious should have embarrassed her, but instead she felt only gratitude. "I am Violet Preston," she said between careful spoonfuls of stew. "I was living in Denver with my stepbrother after my mother passed last summer. Before that, we were in Philadelphia, but Marcus wanted to come west for new opportunities. I see now that he really just wanted to get me away from anyone who might have questioned my convenient disappearance." Xavier settled into a chair near the bed, his own bowl of stew balanced on his knee. "You do not have any other family?" "No one," Violet said, and was surprised by how the admission made her throat tighten. "My real father died when I was 7. My mother remarried a year later to Marcus's father, who died 2 years ago. Mother followed him 6 months back. I thought Marcus and I were at least friends, even if we were not truly brother and sister. We grew up together from the time I was 8 years old. I never imagined he could do something like this." "Greed makes people capable of terrible things," Xavier said quietly. "I am sorry you had to learn that lesson so harshly." They ate in companionable silence for a while, and Violet found herself watching Xavier when she thought he was not looking. There was something solid and reassuring about him, something that made her feel safe for the first time in months. When she had finished as much of the stew as she could manage, he took the bowl and brought her more water, then checked the bandage on her forehead with the careful focus of someone used to tending injuries. "You were a trapper, you said," Violet asked as he worked. "Is that how you ended up out here?" "I was a cowboy originally," Xavier said, his fingers light on her skin as he examined the cut. "Worked ranches down in Texas, around Fort Worth, from the time I was 15 until about 3 years ago. But I wanted something different, wanted to see the mountains and try my hand at trapping and hunting. I have got this cabin and my trap lines, and I make a decent living selling furs. It is a solitary life, but I like the quiet." "You must get lonely," Violet said, then immediately felt foolish for saying it. "I am sorry, that was too personal." "It is all right," Xavier said, and she thought she caught the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "And yes, sometimes I do. But I have made friends in Winter Creek, and I go down to town every few weeks for supplies and company. It is enough." He stepped back, apparently satisfied with his examination. "The cut is shallow. It should heal clean. You were lucky." "Lucky," Violet repeated with a faint laugh. "I suppose I was in the end. Lucky that you found me." "I almost did not," Xavier admitted, returning to his chair. "I was taking a different route back to the cabin, but something made me change my mind at the last minute. I do not know what, just a feeling that I should go the longer way. If I had not, I never would have seen you there in the snow." Violet shivered despite the warmth of the blankets, thinking about how close she had come to dying alone in that frozen wilderness. "I believe in Providence," she said softly. "I think you were meant to find me." The storm that blew in that night was fierce, rattling the cabin windows and piling snow against the walls in great drifts. Xavier had given Violet the bed and made himself a pallet by the fire, despite her protests. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind howl and watching the firelight dance on the ceiling, very aware of Xavier's presence just a few feet away. She had never been alone with a man like this before, had never been in such an intimate situation, but strangely she felt no fear or impropriety. Xavier had been nothing but respectful and kind, treating her with a gentle care that made something warm bloom in her chest. "Are you all right?" His voice came soft through the darkness. "Do you need anything for the pain?" "I am fine," Violet said, though her ribs ached with every breath. "I just cannot stop thinking about Marcus, about how he planned this, how he looked at me when he pushed me. I thought I knew him." She heard Xavier shift, sitting up on his pallet. It is not your fault. You could not have known what he was capable of. Could not I? Violet asked, surprising herself with the bitterness in her voice. He was always cold, always calculating. Even when we were children, he was the type to arrange things to his advantage. I just never thought he would go this far. I never thought he would try to kill me. He will answer for what he did, Xavier said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness. Once we get you to Winter Creek and the storm clears, I will help you go to the law. They will find him. Will they? Violet asked. Or will they just see a woman making accusations against her own family? Marcus is charming when he wants to be. He will have some story prepared, something about how I fell accidentally and he searched for me but could not find me in the storm. It will be his word against mine. Then we will make sure they believe you, Xavier said firmly. You have injuries consistent with being thrown from a moving vehicle, and you have me as a witness to testify about the state I found you in. That has to count for something. Violet wanted to believe him, but she had seen too much of how the world worked to have much faith in justice. Still, she appreciated his conviction, his certainty that right would prevail. It was oddly comforting, even if she suspected it was naive. The storm raged for 2 full days, keeping them trapped in the cabin with nothing to do but talk and tend the fire and try to pass the time. Violet learned that Xavier had grown up on a small ranch in Texas, the youngest of 4 boys, and that he had come west after his parents died, and his eldest brother took over the family property. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise, making her laugh even when her ribs protested the movement, and he was surprisingly well-read for a man who lived alone in the mountains. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married, Xavier explained when Violet commented on the small collection of books stacked neatly on a shelf. She made sure all of us boys could read and write and figure. Said she would not have any sons of hers growing up ignorant, even if we were going to work with cattle and horses all our lives. She sounds like a wise woman, Violet said. She was sitting up in bed now, feeling stronger though her arms still throbbed and her ribs ached. Xavier had fashioned a better sling for her, and she was managing to feed herself and move around a little, though he still hovered protectively whenever she tried to do too much. She was, Xavier agreed, and Violet heard the grief in his voice. She died of influenza 5 years ago. My father followed her 6 months later. I think he just did not want to go on without her. They were like that, completely devoted to each other. It was something to see. Violet felt a pang of envy. Her mother and stepfather had been cordial to each other, even affectionate at times, but she had never seen the kind of deep love Xavier described. That must have been wonderful to grow up around. It was, Xavier said. It also made me realize I did not want to settle for anything less. I have seen men marry for convenience or money or just because it is expected, and I always swore I would not do that. If I ever marry, it will be because I have found someone I cannot imagine living without. He was looking at the fire as he spoke, not at her, but Violet felt her cheeks warm and her heart beat a little faster. There was something in his voice, something wistful and hopeful at once, that made her wonder if he was thinking about her. The thought should have seemed ridiculous after only 2 days, but there was an intimacy to their situation that seemed to compress time, to make them know each other in ways that might have taken weeks or months under normal circumstances. On the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. Violet woke to bright sunlight streaming through the cabin window and the sound of Xavier moving around, preparing for the journey to Winter Creek. Her arm felt better. The sharp agony faded to a dull ache, and her ribs were tender but manageable. She was still weak from her ordeal, but she was determined to make the trip, anxious to see a proper doctor and to start the process of bringing Marcus to justice. Xavier had hitched his horse to a small sled, lining it with blankets and furs to make it as comfortable as possible for Violet. He lifted her onto it with the same careful gentleness he had shown since finding her, and she found herself very aware of the strength in his arms, the warmth of his body close to hers. Their eyes met as he settled her into place, and something passed between them, some acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing over the past 3 days. "Ready?" he asked softly. "Ready," Violet confirmed, and Xavier clicked to his horse and they set off through the snow-covered wilderness toward Winter Creek. The journey took most of the day, the horse moving slowly through the deep snow, but the sky remained clear, and the air, while cold, was still and almost pleasant after the fury of the storm. Xavier walked beside the sled, one hand on the horse's bridle, and he pointed out landmarks as they traveled, telling her stories about the mountains and the creatures that lived there. Violet found herself fascinated, not just by what he was saying but by the way he said it, the obvious love he had for this wild country. Winter Creek turned out to be a small but thriving mining town nestled in a valley between 2 peaks. Xavier took her straight to the doctor, a gruff older man named Dr. Harrison, who examined her thoroughly and pronounced Xavier's field medicine to be surprisingly competent. "You have got a good clean break in the arm, and those ribs will heal on their own with rest, Doctor," Harrison said as he applied a proper plaster cast to her forearm. "You are a lucky young woman, Miss Preston. Another hour in that snow and you would not have made it." "I know," Violet said, glancing at Xavier, who stood near the door watching the proceedings with concerned eyes. "I owe Mr. Thompson my life." Dr. Harrison followed her gaze and something knowing passed over his weathered face. "Xavier is a good man, one of the best I have known. You could not have asked for a better person to find you." After leaving the doctor's office, Xavier took Violet to the town's small hotel and secured her a room, paying for a week in advance despite her protests. "You need a proper bed and regular meals," he insisted, "and we need to talk to the sheriff about what happened to you." The sheriff was a tall, stern-faced man named Garrett who listened to Violet's story with an increasingly dark expression. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "This is a serious accusation, Miss Preston," he said. "Attempted murder is not something we take lightly. But I have got to tell you, finding your stepbrother is going to be difficult if he is smart enough to have put distance between himself and where he left you. Still, I will send out telegrams to the surrounding towns, alert the law in Denver, and see what we can turn up. Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" "Back to Denver, probably," Violet said. "To claim my inheritance and pretend to mourn me. He has no reason to think I survived." "Then we have got the element of surprise," Sheriff Garrett said. "That might work in our favor. I will start the investigation immediately and I will keep you informed of any developments." He glanced at Xavier. "You will be staying in town for a while," Xavier said. "I am not leaving Violet alone to deal with this." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Good man." Over the following days, Violet settled into a strange new routine in Winter Creek. Xavier visited her every day at the hotel, bringing her meals and books and news of the investigation. He had taken a room at the boarding house, he told her, and was putting his trapping on hold until her situation was resolved. Violet protested that he should not be sacrificing his livelihood for her, but Xavier waved off her concerns. "The furs will still be there when I go back," he said. "You are more important." The simple statement made Violet's breath catch. They were sitting in the small parlor of the hotel, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, and Xavier was looking at her with an expression that made her heart race. Over the past week, the connection between them had deepened, grown into something she was almost afraid to name. She found herself thinking about him constantly, looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that went far beyond gratitude or friendship. "Xavier," she said softly, "I cannot ask you to put your life on hold for me. You barely know me." "I know you well enough," Xavier said, leaning forward in his chair. "I know you are brave and strong and resilient. I know you make me laugh even when you are in pain. I know that I have not been able to stop thinking about you since I found you in that snow." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I know that I am falling in love with you, Violet Preston, and I do not care if it has only been a week or if people think it is too fast. Some things you just know." Violet felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling the moment I opened my eyes and saw you looking down at me with such concern. You made me feel safe when I had no reason to feel anything but terror." Xavier crossed to her in 2 strides, kneeling beside her chair and taking her good hand in both of his. "Then let me keep you safe," he said urgently. "Let me be the one who stands beside you through all of this. And when it is over, when Marcus has been dealt with and you are free, say you will consider staying here, with me." "Xavier, I have nothing," Violet said, the tears spilling over now. "If Marcus has already claimed my inheritance, I am penniless. I cannot be a burden to you." "You could never be a burden," Xavier said fiercely. "I do not care about money or inheritances. I have got my cabin and my trap lines, and that is enough for 2 people to live on, more than enough. I am not asking you to marry me right this moment, though God knows I want to. I am just asking you to think about building a life here, with me." Violet brought her good hand up to cup his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble against her palm. "I do not need to think about it. Yes, Xavier, yes to all of it. I want to stay here with you. I want to build a life with you. I have never been more certain of anything." Xavier's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, brilliant and warm and full of joy. He leaned up and kissed her, gentle and reverent, and Violet felt something broken inside her begin to heal. This man, this good and gentle man, loved her, wanted her, saw her as something precious worth protecting. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. The investigation into Marcus's whereabouts took 3 weeks, but eventually word came back from Denver. He had indeed returned to the city, and was in the process of trying to claim Violet's inheritance, having reported her as missing and presumed dead. The Denver police, alerted by Sheriff Garrett, arrested him on charges of attempted murder. Marcus denied everything, of course, claiming Violet had fallen from the sleigh accidentally, and he had searched for her but been unable to find her in the storm. But Violet's testimony, combined with Xavier's account of finding her in a location that made no sense for an accidental fall, and the timing of Marcus's suspicious return to Denver without having made any real effort to recover her body, was enough to convince a judge. Marcus was held for trial, and Violet's inheritance was frozen pending the outcome of the case. Violet had to return to Denver for the trial, and Xavier accompanied her without question. They took the train from Colorado to Denver, and Violet was grateful for his solid presence beside her as the city grew closer. She had not thought she would ever return to this place, had not wanted to, but she knew she had to face Marcus one final time and see justice done. The trial was difficult. Marcus played the role of grieving stepbrother to perfection, weeping on the stand as he told his version of events. But the prosecution was thorough, and Violet's own testimony was damning. She spoke clearly and calmly about Marcus's attempts to get her to sign over her inheritance, about his sudden insistence on the trip to their aunt's house, about the cold calculation in his eyes as he pushed her from the moving sleigh. When the prosecution asked why her stepbrother would want to kill her, she explained about the trust fund and how he would inherit it if she died. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Marcus was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and Violet's inheritance was restored to her. As the judge banged his gavel and the bailiffs led Marcus away, he turned to look at her one final time, and there was nothing but hatred in his eyes. Violet felt Xavier's hand tighten on hers, and she knew that whatever happened next, she would never have to face Marcus again. They returned to Winter Creek as soon as the trial was over, and Violet felt a sense of homecoming as the little mountain town came into view. Xavier's cabin felt like sanctuary when they finally arrived, the fire crackling warmly and the snow-covered peaks rising around them in peaceful isolation. That night, Xavier asked her properly to marry him, and Violet said yes without a moment's hesitation. They were wed in the small church in Winter Creek on a bright day in late March 1885, with half the town in attendance and Dr. Harrison standing up as Xavier's best man. Violet wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool, and Xavier looked impossibly handsome in his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his eyes shining with happiness. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Xavier kissed her with such tenderness that Violet felt tears slide down her cheeks. They spent the first year of their marriage in Xavier's cabin, learning each other's rhythms and building their life together. Violet discovered that she loved the solitary mountain life more than she had ever loved the crowded cities of her youth. She learned to cook venison and rabbit, to tan hides and stretch furs, to read the weather in the shape of clouds and the behavior of animals. Xavier taught her to ride his horse, to snowshoe through the deep winter drifts, to find her way by the stars. With her restored inheritance, they were able to expand Xavier's trapping operation and purchase more equipment. They bought a second horse and eventually a milk cow, and Violet started a small garden near the cabin that produced vegetables through the short mountain summer. It was a hard life, but it was a good life, and Violet had never been happier. Their first child, a son they named James after Xavier's father, was born in the spring of 1887 during a late-season snowstorm. Dr. Harrison made it to the cabin just in time, and Xavier paced outside in the snow until the old doctor emerged with a squalling bundle in his arms and a huge grin on his weathered face. Xavier held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Violet thought her heart might burst with the love she felt for both of them. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, Emily Rose, with her mother's dark hair and her father's warm brown eyes. Xavier was just as smitten with his little girl as he had been with his son, and Violet often found him rocking her to sleep by the fire, singing old cowboy songs in his soft drawl while Emily clutched his finger with her tiny hand. As the years passed, Xavier and Violet's love only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, and the hard winters could strain anyone's patience, but they never went to bed angry and they never took each other for granted. Xavier still looked at Violet like she was the most precious thing in the world, and Violet still felt her heart skip when he walked through the door after a day on the trap lines. When James was 7 and Emily 5, they decided it was time to build a larger house, one with separate bedrooms for the growing children and more space for the life they had created. They chose a spot near the old cabin but with a better view of the valley, and Xavier spent 2 summers cutting logs and raising walls while Violet and the children helped as much as they could. The new house was solid and warm, with a big stone fireplace and windows that let in the mountain light, and Violet cried when they moved in, overwhelmed by how far she had come from that terrified girl dying in the snow. News reached them occasionally from Denver, usually months old by the time it made it to Winter Creek. Marcus had been released early for good behavior after serving 10 years of his sentence. Violet learned from a letter forwarded by her lawyer. He had left Colorado immediately upon his release, heading east, and she had never heard from him again. She felt nothing when she learned of his release, no fear or anger, just a mild indifference. Marcus was part of a past that felt like it had happened to someone else, and she had no room in her heart for thoughts of him. In 1895, when Violet was 32 and Xavier 35, they welcomed another son, a surprise baby they named Thomas, who completed their family. James was eager to help with his baby brother, and Emily appointed herself Thomas's protector, watching over him with the fierce devotion of a big sister. Xavier built a cradle that rocked by the fire, and Violet would sit with Thomas in her arms while Xavier played with James and Emily, and think about how impossibly blessed she was. The children grew strong and healthy in the mountain air. James developed his father's love of the wilderness, and by 12 was accompanying Xavier on his longer trapping expeditions. Emily had her mother's quick mind and her father's determination, and she announced at 10 years old that she was going to be a teacher like her grandmother had been. Thomas, the baby, was sunny-natured and curious about everything, following his older siblings around and asking endless questions that they answered with patient affection. In the autumn of 1900, when the new century was fresh and full of promise, Xavier and Violet celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. The children had conspired with Dr. Harrison and some of their friends in Winter Creek to throw them a surprise party, and Violet laughed until she cried at the sight of the little church hall, decorated with wildflowers and bunting. Xavier pulled her into his arms for a dance while someone played the fiddle, and they swayed together like they had at their wedding, still as in love as they had been that March day 15 years before. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked softly as they danced, his breath warm against her ear. "Choosing this life? Staying here with me instead of going back east where things are easier?" Violet pulled back to look at him, at the face she knew as well as her own, at the man who had saved her life, and then filled it with so much love and joy. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed. A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love, Xavier Thompson, and that is worth more than all the comfort and ease in the world." Xavier's eyes were suspiciously bright. "You gave me the same thing, Violet. You walked into my solitary life and filled it with light and laughter and love. I cannot imagine what my life would have been like if I had not found you that day in the snow." "Providence," Violet said, echoing what she had told him that first night in his cabin. "We were meant to find each other." "I believe that," Xavier said, and kissed her while their children cheered and their friends applauded and the fiddle played on. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing of the seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. James grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, and at 19 married a girl from Winter Creek named Sarah, who was as comfortable in the wilderness as he was. They built their own cabin not far from Xavier and Violet's house, and when their first child was born, Violet became a grandmother and marveled at how quickly time had flown. Emily went away to Teachers College in Denver, the first in their family to pursue higher education, and Violet felt a bittersweet pride as she watched her daughter board the stage that would take her to the train station. Emily returned 2 years later with her teaching certificate and took a position at the school in Winter Creek, boarding with a family in town during the week and coming home to the mountain on weekends. She was courted by the new deputy sheriff, a serious young man named Robert who treated her like she was made of something precious, and they were married in the same little church where Xavier and Violet had wed. Thomas, their surprise baby, grew up to have his father's way with animals and his mother's head for business. He expanded the family's trapping operation into a proper fur trading business, traveling to Denver and even as far as Chicago to sell their goods. He brought back stories of the changing world, of automobiles and electric lights and telephones, but he always came home to the mountains, saying he could never live anywhere else. Xavier and Violet grew old together in the house he had built for her, their hair turning gray and then white, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. On cold winter nights, they would sit by the fire while Xavier whittled and Violet knitted, and they would talk about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had built, about how grateful they were for every moment they had been given. "Do you remember what you looked like that day I found you?" Xavier asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, the fire burning low and the snow falling softly outside. Half frozen and covered in blood, but still fighting to live. "I remember thinking I was going to die," Violet said softly. "And then I remember seeing your face and thinking that if this was an angel come to take me to heaven, I was all right with that." Xavier laughed, the sound rich and warm. "An angel, that is a good one." "I am pretty sure I looked more like a snow-covered trapper who had not shaved in a week." "You looked like salvation," Violet said simply. "You looked like hope, and you have been both those things to me ever since." Xavier reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that plagued his joints. "I love you, Violet Thompson. I have loved you since the moment I saw you fighting to survive in that snowbank. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Violet said, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. "You saved my life that day in the snow, but you did more than that. You gave me a reason to live. You gave me everything." They sat together in the firelight, hands clasped. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of love and purpose. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the Colorado mountains, covering the world in white. But inside their home, there was only warmth and peace, and the quiet contentment of a love that had endured for decades and would endure still. When Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Violet grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 45 years together, 45 years of laughter and love and shared purpose. She buried him in the little cemetery in Winter Creek, with all their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered around. And she spoke at his service about the day he had found her in the snow, and how he had spent the rest of his life making sure she never felt cold or alone again. Violet lived another 8 years, surrounded by the family she and Xavier had created, spending her final years teaching her great-grandchildren to read and telling them stories about the wild west of her youth, and the cowboy who had saved her life and captured her heart. When she died at 83, also peacefully in her sleep, her children buried her beside Xavier under the tall pines, and on her headstone they carved the words she had said so often over the years. "Providence brought us together." The house Xavier built still stood decades later, occupied by generation after generation of Thompsons, each one carrying forward the legacy of love and resilience that Xavier and Violet had established. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down to children and grandchildren, a tale of courage and survival, and the enduring power of love found in the most unexpected circumstances. And in the cold winters when the snow fell heavy on the Colorado mountains, the Thompson descendants would sit by the fire in that sturdy house and remember the woman who had been thrown from a moving sleigh to die in the frozen wilderness, and the cowboy who had found her and brought her home, not just to his cabin but into his heart, where she had remained for the rest of their lives.